I want to say welcome to everyone who's joining us. Today is Labor Day, and in the spirit with which that holiday was created, I just want to first acknowledge the labor of all those who have in the past and continue to labor for racial justice and the fight against all manner of discrimination and oppression. And when the Gaines Center for the Humanities began thinking about how we might make a contribution to the current discussions of violence and justice, we thought actually quite quickly of the work of Dr. George Wright. And we called on our friends in the African American and Africana Studies program in the Cooperative for Humanities and Social Sciences to think about, to reach out to our like minded networks to begin a conversation at our institution grounded in a historical context. So Dr. George C. Wright received his undergraduate and doctorate degrees from the University of Kentucky. In the law school, Dr. Wright, we call that when you get an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree from Kentucky, we call those super cats. He has served on the faculties of Duke University and University of Texas, but began his career as an assistant professor right here at the University of Kentucky. And we are so glad to have him come back home again to serve the University of Kentucky in this critical moment as the interim vice president for institutional diversity and senior advisor to President Capelouto. Among the many leadership roles he has had, I came to know him when he was named the 7th president of Prairie View A&M University, the second oldest institution of higher education in the state of Texas, and my beloved alma mater. He has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, grants, and awards, including being awarded the honorary doctorate for letters from the University of Kentucky. Among the accomplishments I have mentioned, if you talk to George Wright, I think he will tell you that his most consistent identity and passion is that of a history professor. And through his articles, books, and lectures, he has more than anyone documented the history of lynching, mob violence, and legal lynching in Kentucky. And so we are so honored to provide the space for our community to learn from Dr. George C. Wright. And with that, we turn it over to Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Dr. Price, and good evening to everyone. And as she mentioned, I really appreciate your taking the time to come to this webinar. Anytime that you would do it, I would appreciate that, but especially on a holiday and especially with the start of school, and I know everyone is busy. I will be speaking primarily for my book, which is entitled Racial Violence in Kentucky, Lynchings, Mob Rule, and Legal Lynchings, 1865 to 1940, that was published a long time ago in 1990. My growing up in Kentucky and being told repeatedly that conditions were not as bad for Black people as conditions in the Deep South, and according to some people, conditions for Kentucky Blacks were even better than some places in the North and the South. That was one of the things that motivated me. Because in growing up in Lexington, we had experienced what seemed like a consistent and rigid form of racial segregation. Just one example, we could only go to Jorland Amusement Park, which was located in what is out in the area now by Bryan Station High School, on Negro Day. And that was twice in the summer. Most African Americans could not go to the public library. Instead, the only way they could get library books was when the bookmobile came into your neighborhood, probably once every 2 weeks. Furthermore, even though people said conditions were not as bad in Kentucky as elsewhere, including in some instances the North or the South, the same people would give me examples of prominent Black Kentuckians, but she or he, interestingly, did not live in Kentucky, but were living in one of these places that allegedly were not as bad as Kentucky, in some instances, even in the Deep South. My first book was on Blacks in Louisville, and I discussed the concept of what I call polite racism. Maybe you would say, how can racism be polite in any manner? Well, under Louisville and Lexington, even though I didn't write about Lexington, but Lexington was similar, um, whites often deluded themselves into saying they treated their Black people better than, again, than elsewhere. Under polite racism, while segregation existed, Blacks had a public high school, something not found everywhere. Blacks had a YMCA, a YWCA, they even had their own public library. Polite racism in some instances meant segregated institutions, which may have been better than no institutions at all. But polite racism was an effective means of racial control. And it's also important to understand that polite racism in Louisville existed as long as Blacks willingly accepted their place at the bottom of society, and if they dared not challenge the racial status quo. If in Lexington or Louisville, if Blacks challenged the racial status quo, then whites resorted to a much more brutal form of racial oppression that was similar to other places. But polite racism existed in Louisville. A key point. My research also showed that the polite racism of Lexington and Louisville did not extend to rural and small Kentucky towns. In these places, Blacks existed in conditions that were the same as conditions in the Deep South. So even if you concede and say, okay, Lexington and Louisville were different in race relations than many other places, that was not the case for the rest of Kentucky. For in the rest of Kentucky, there existed a form of racism, of oppression that mirrored what was happening further south. Furthermore, I was motivated to write the book because I had long believed that justice did not exist for Black Americans. I'm not exaggerating. From the time I was a teenager forward, even though I couldn't quite articulate it the same way, I used to say something like, in the Lexington courthouse, there was a statue of John Hunt Morgan out there. How can Black people receive justice with John Hunt Morgan, a Confederate, sitting out there? And so from the time that I was a teenager, when people said justice, I said just us. I said just us. And again, this may seem trite to you, but I had decided that if I were ever in court charged with some kind of crime, I was going to say, don't give me justice, give me what you give white people, which is mercy. In that regard. But I did not believe that justice existed for Black Americans in the context that we use that term. Yet another reason for writing the book on racial violence. One of the most prominent scholars in American history was a man named Richard Hofstadter. And he wrote an essay called Reflections on Violence in the United States. In this article, Professor Hofstadter pointed out that violence, especially racial and ethnic violence, had always been a part of American culture. He said from the moment that Europeans arrived on the shores of North and South America, violence had come with them. Then he said something, and I'm paraphrasing what Hofstadter said, is what is most exceptional about the American people is not the voluminous records of their racial violence. There's a lot of documentation of that, but their extraordinary ability in the face of that record to persuade themselves that they were among the most behaved, the best regulated, the most peace-loving people on earth. He said, Their record clearly shows a pattern of racial and ethnic violence. He said, in spite of that, they somehow said that they actually believed that they were law-abiding people. Then Hofstadter's key point, he said that lynchings, the killing of people by a mob, lynchings was a distinctively American institution. The primary function of lynchings, Hofstadter concluded, was to make sure that Afro-Americans understood their place. And so Hofstadter and others, even though they said there were white people, there were ethnic groups from Europe who were lynched in addition to blacks, but in proportion to their numbers in the population, where blacks would comprise a relatively small percentage, 85 to 90% of the people lynched were blacks. He said that was clearly something designed to make sure that black people understood and remained in their place. My study of racial violence is divided into three distinct parts. Part one is on lynchings, and part A of part one, I hope that's not confusing, part A of part one covers the period 1865 to 1880. Most scholars, when they talk about lynchings, pointed out that the period 1880 to 1920 was when most lynchings occurred. What they should have said, that's when most of the documentation that they were aware of, starting with the Chicago Tribune's cataloging of lynchings, started in the 1880s. Tuskegee Institute started cataloging lynchings in the 1880s. But the heyday of lynching, I argue in my book, was the period immediately after slavery, 1865 to 1880. During that 15-year period in Kentucky, and by extension in other places in the South, I would argue fully 1/3 of the lynchings occurred then. Here's something that made Kentucky unique, and if Kentucky's number were higher than other places, here's the reason why. Many people forget that Kentucky had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War and was spared many of the Reconstruction measures that the Deep South, the Confederate States, had to conform to. Interestingly, Kentucky, unlike Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and so forth, voted against the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. By having remained loyal, white Kentuckians were free to handle what they called the Negro problem as they saw fit. I'm not exaggerating when saying that if you go to Record Group 105 in the National Archives, you will see the Freedmen Bureau papers talking about what was happening during this time period. And there are numerous examples of where whites would say, we had no problems in Kentucky. Oh, we had to kill a few black people, but that really wasn't a problem. Many lynchings occurred during this time period. They were primarily political in nature, and unlike the later period, they often occurred at night. But it's Record Group 105 that helps me document them. It is using the Cincinnati newspaper, the Lexington newspaper, the Louisville newspaper, and things like that, that I'm able to document lynchings in this period, 1865 to 1880. Then there is lynchings part B, which occurs 1880 to 1840. This is the period where lynchings are most often held in the daytime. There are even lynchings that occurred in carnival-like environments. And it is during this time period that lynchings most clearly have the open approval of the general white public. And in state after state, north, south, east, and west, often the governor and others will give their approval to a lynching that had occurred, and even worse, a lynching that was yet to occur. I could give you for the rest of the afternoon examples of lynchings that occurred in Kentucky, but I will just briefly touch upon 3 lynchings that occurred in Kentucky. In 1899, in Maysville, which borders the Ohio River, a Black man was accused of rape and murder. Now, I said accused, since he did not have a trial, we don't fully know. The fact that he confessed under torture does not mean that he really did it. But nevertheless, it was announced in advance that he would be burned at the stake. And so a huge crowd gathered. And in my book, I even talk about an elderly white woman in a wheelchair in excruciating pain who goes all the way to the front to make sure she sees it. The family of the woman who had been killed get to do the deed first. And they take hot pokers and they start at his feet and they burn him all the way up, putting out his eyes, his tongue, and so forth. This is the Maysville, Kentucky lynching of 1899. The governor, the state police, everyone is aware of it. Their thing is, given the nature of the crime, this is what was deserved. A lynching occurs in Logan County, Russellville in August 1908. And by then, there are photographers who go to a number of places, and this hanging of these 4 young men would make national news. I have a copy of that in my book as well. There's a note attached to one of the young men. They're in their late teens, early 20s, saying, "This is what happens to ends who mess with white people." And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Then in 1912, in the small Kentucky city of Livermore, Kentucky, a Black man and a white man get into a fight. The white man shoots at the Black man shoots and kills the white man. That sounds like self-defense, so forth. But nevertheless, he was arrested and put in the jail, but they then take him from the jail to the Livermore Opera House. And they charge admissions price for people to come and witness the lynching that was to take place. Those sitting closest to the front, who had paid more than folks sitting further back, when the word was given, they were allowed to shoot their guns into the person. A newspaper in Paris, France would even capture this. And back then, the newspapers often thought these things were funny. And one newspaper reporter said, "The Black who made his first and only appearance on stage at the Livermore Opera House will never offend the sensibilities of white people again." Most scholars, in documenting the number of lynchings that occurred in the United States, have said there were somewhere around 5,000 lynchings between, let's say, the 1860s until the practice ended in, let's say, 1950. Though I understand you could argue certain things that happened even later happened. And these same scholars would say that Kentucky ranked 9th with 209 lynchings. My research on Kentucky, my going through various records, my going to all 120 counties and so forth, my conservative count was 353. And in my book, I show the readers how I throw out numerous other lynchings. In other words, my number then jumps Kentucky from 9th to something like 5th. But the reality is, those places like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas that are higher up on the list than Kentucky, if the same type of studies were done there, then the number would increase. So Kentucky probably is ninth. But what am I saying? Instead of 4,000 or 5,000 lynchings, there were probably closer to 12,000 lynchings. Or another way to look at it, a lynching occurred in the United States every other day for more than 60 years. That's another way of looking at lynchings. Part 2 of my book is on something I call mob rule. In 1860, Blacks lived all over Kentucky. You take a map of Kentucky in 1860, pretty much Black people lived in every county. By 1920, take a map of Kentucky, and there were pockets in the state where no Blacks lived. And that would be the case until when? That's a question I ask. Here's what happened. In places like, in certain places in Western Kentucky, Trigg County, Marshall County are two that can be documented. In the early 1900s, whites decided to take the farmlands owned by Blacks, and in some instances, these African Americans had owned this land since the end of slavery, that they were warned that they had to leave this land by a certain date. And guess what? They left those lands by a certain date. Are they risk being killed? So there are places in Kentucky where this happened. And then, of course, a lot of people are aware of the Corbin incident of 1919. In the 1910s, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad made Corbin, Kentucky, one of its stops. And so there was work going on there, a railroad-related work. A Black community of some 200 people grows there. An incident occurs in October 1919, and it's the typical kind of incident where a white woman alleges that she had been assaulted, not raped, an attempted rape. She cannot identify who the person is, but everyone was convinced it was an African American. All of the African Americans were put on a train and forced to leave Corbin. In growing up in Kentucky, I knew that no one Black lived there. Back in the 1980s, a filmmaker and I did a documentary called Don't Let the Sun Go Down on this incident in Corbin, Kentucky. Last year, October of last year, was the 100th anniversary, and the city of Corbin, led by actually some UK students and others, had talked about for some 6 months prior to that, a certain acknowledgement of what had happened there, of reconciliation and so forth. And back in March or April, I was invited to come to Corbin to speak in October 1919. As the date moved closer and closer, I realized that no one had followed up with me. And so I eventually contacted the folk, and they said for whatever reason, they decided to no longer have the program. And of course, I was no longer invited to give a presentation there. But nevertheless, this was part of the mob rule that would lead to Black people not living in certain parts of Kentucky. Part 3 of my book is what I call, and I realized, how can I describe the lynching that happened in Maysville in 1899, as horrific as that was. Then I come to part 3 and say the most brutal form of racial violence was legal lynching. How can I say that? The reason I say that is that there's no question that lynchings was something that occurred outside of the law, even though it occurred with the tacit approval of the law. But legal lynchings were sanctioned by the law. Earlier, I mentioned that 4 young men were hanged in Russellville, Logan County. Here's what happened. A 5th young man by the name of Rufus Browder was a sharecropper to a man named Sam Cunningham. Tired of the mistreatment at the hands of Cunningham, Browder decided to just simply quit and leave. So Browder, his young wife, Browder's in his, let's say 25, his wife, several children, they're in a wagon moving away from Cunningham's place. Cunningham runs in front of the wagon and stops the wagon and hits Browder with a whip, cutting him over his face. That can be documented. Browder still tries to go forward. Cunningham pulls out his gun and shoots Browder in the side. That can be documented. Browder pulls out his gun and shoots Cunningham, killing him. Browder is then arrested, but they take him to Louisville for safekeeping. These 4 other young men whose bodies were hanging later, they were friends. They were also sharecroppers, and the whites said they were plotting to kill whites in that community, and they were arrested, taken from jail, and hanged. Browder would be tried. In his first trial, he would be sentenced to death. A second trial ends with him being sentenced to, let's say, life in prison. Browder would die under mysterious conditions 4 years until his prison sentence. That is legal lynching. In part 3 of my book, I say that as the number of lynchings decline in Kentucky, 1910s, 1920s, the number of state-sanctioned executions of Black men increased. And that I say that the state started performing the task of the mob. To give you an example, there are trials, if you choose to call them trials in Kentucky, where the legal system pleads with the mob to allow the trial to take place, and they promise that the Black person will be executed immediately thereafter. The Black person, in turn, would plead guilty, knowing that he would be hanged, but at least he would be spared what happened in Maysville in 1899. There are trials, I'm doing in parenthesis, in Kentucky that would last no more than an hour. That would be the swearing in of the jury. That would be the testimony being given. That would be the deliberation of the jury. And then the person was executed immediately thereafter. After a while, the state of Kentucky passes a 30-day cooling off period, saying that there has to be 30 days lapse from when a person is found guilty and the execution is carried out. But you read the court record and it says that given the fervor of the crowd, we went ahead and waived that. That proves right there that the person could not have had a fair trial. Toward the end of my book, I talk about how one of the governors in the 1910s had actually worked to end lynchings, that he said lynchings dishonored the state of Kentucky and so forth. But check this out. Around 1915, a mentally retarded Black teenager was accused of raping a white young woman the same age. At best, they had had consensual sex, but it's likely that the young man wasn't even aware of what any of this meant. He was sentenced to death. Shortly before he was to be executed, the prosecutor and the judge said to the governor that this person really did not understand what he had been charged with. The governor looked at this case and the governor ruled, he said, it is a shame that disformed people have been allowed to live in our society. As a result of this, quote, deformity, the governor said, it's acceptable to allow this person to be put to death. To me, and I realize that as a scholar, I'm not supposed to judge people by the time in which I live in. I find it totally unacceptable that people could reach such a conclusion about the life of other people. In total, some 229 people, almost all men, 90% Black, were executed by the state of Kentucky from 1865 to 1940. In 1939, the United States Supreme Court, in a death penalty case from Paducah called Hale versus Kentucky, said no one Black has served on criminal cases in the state of Kentucky, and this needs to change. This is 1939. But in 1968, in a case called Baston versus Kentucky from Louisville, the court said that in Kentucky, prosecutors were using their preemptive challenges to keep Black people from serving on criminal cases, and that it was not occurring. So in my book, I conclude by asking, when did legal lynchings end in Kentucky? Indeed, have legal lynchings ended in the state of Kentucky? As I close, there has been a resurgence of interest in my work on racial balance. I mentioned it was published in 1990, and there's been a resurgence of interest for several reasons. Number one, the Smithsonian Afro-American Museum opened, about 5 years ago. And in the section dealing with the period after slavery down to the early, I'll say to 1910, it has an illustration of one of my lynchings of these 4 young men that I've talked about. So a number of people have seen it there, or they've seen some of the other illustrations in the Smithsonian, and that's led to them becoming interested once again in the topic of lynchings. Some of you may know the important work by Brian Stevenson that has long been working to end the unfairness in the criminal justice system. About 3 years ago in Montgomery, Alabama, his museum dedicated to the victims of lynchings opened, and he has these huge blocks of stone that he says the cities can come and these are for a lynching in a particular place. There, he has 8 of these stones from Kentucky, and these are all lynchings that I document in Kentucky as well. And so his museum has led to a resurgence of lynchings in Kentucky. Then the movie based on Stevenson's legal work, Just Mercy, came out, maybe 2 years ago now. And it has led to a resurgence of interest for me in my legal lynchings. Here's what I've said to people. If you've seen the movie Just Mercy, it shows Stevenson as the attorney for, let's say, 6 men in Alabama on death row. Okay, but here's what you ought to think about. What about from 1865 forward, all of the Black people who were unfairly tried for crimes that were not often the death penalty crimes? And they were told, you better plead guilty, take 10 years in prison versus 50 years or the rest of your life. So undoubtedly, there are people who've been executed, but think about the tens of thousands of people in places all over the United States who have been unfairly treated. Therefore, I stand by my comment earlier of just us rather than just this. As I assess my book on racial violence in Kentucky, and the first one on Blacks in Louisville, it is clear to me that a theme of mine has been whites have a designated place for Blacks in American society. Earlier in my presentation, I referenced the essay by Richard Hofstadter, who said that this was a major reason for lynchings, that Blacks must stay in their designated place. As I was completing the writing of racial balance, I thought about this again and how my understanding of place had been influenced by Richard Wright in his autobiographical account, Black Boy. Toward the end of Black Boy, as he's leaving the South, he says something to the effect that Black people had a place for him. And in doing so, they had this place because they wanted to protect him. They didn't want him to be too, assertive, too overconfident and the like, because if he got out of his place, it could be to his detriment. He also said the white South had a place for him. He said the white South said they understood me, a Black person. And he said, I never accepted the place that I was assigned to in American society by both Black people and white people. And I think that my scholarship on violence speaks to a determined attempt to keep Black people in their place in Kentucky and in American society. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wright. It's interesting to hear much about Kentucky. So as you know, I write about the death penalty in the contemporary period in the state of Texas. And when you go back and look at the county by county maps of where lynchings took place and how many took place there, if you lay that same map of capital convictions, they line up almost right on top of each other. So, you know, as a scholar, you try to, without the right evidence, to make arguments about a consistent thread, but it's sort of very hard to do away with the imagery of that piece of documentation. And I was wondering if you ever had a chance to take a similar look at Kentucky as well.
Again, I have not done what you've done for Texas, except some of you may know, well, maybe all of you know State Senator Gerald Neal. The State Senator Gerald Neal had legislation passed in Kentucky that if a person is sentenced to death, there has to be then a second hearing to where it has to meet certain standards before a person can be sentenced to death versus life in prison. On several occasions, I've been asked to testify in particular cases where someone has been sentenced to death in Kentucky, and you can clearly see the pattern. Nobody Black has served on juries. Nobody Black this. No one white has ever been convicted of certain kinds of crimes against Black people and the like. So the pattern exists. There is a figure, and I know there are Southern historians at the University of Kentucky that may say something to the effect, for almost 100 years, from Reconstruction probably down to the 1960s, no one white was convicted of first-degree murder of a Black person in the South, much less sentenced to death in that regard. I don't believe, you may tell me otherwise, or someone else may tell me otherwise, that there has ever been a white man sentenced to death for the rape of a Black woman when rape was one of the death penalty crimes. And the other comment that you made, you mentioned doing work in Texas. If Texas were a separate country, they would probably rank #1 in death penalties. If Harris County, Texas was a separate country, it would probably be #1 in putting people to death. So there are some places where people are very likely to receive the death penalty in the United States, and Texas is one of them.
So we have some questions in the Q&A box, and if anybody who has questions would like to add them, I will try and get as many of them in the next 15 minutes as I can. So we have a couple questions, I think, from students. There's students with us today.
Okay.
And they have asked, how has your research changed your personal view of Kentucky? And also, at any point when you were doing the research, did you want to stop because of the findings or the history that you uncovered?
Okay. Um, I think in the sense of where I started out, where I was told consistently that Kentucky had better race relations than other places, I come to find out that a lot of states will make an assertion like that. If I had been talking about the slavery period, I would have said that Kentucky often boasted of having the mildest form of slavery in the United States. Well, Missouri probably said that. Tennessee probably said that. But what we're showing is tragically, Kentucky was no different than elsewhere. But to the second part of the question, I think at some point when you're reading the accounts, or are you looking at the photographs of these people, for me, I can put myself in their place by saying these folk were human beings just like I am. They had family, they had loved ones. What makes me laugh made them laugh. What made them cry, and so forth. And I cannot imagine the pain. But here's what else I can't understand. I truly do not understand the people who would go and witness lynchings. I'm sorry. Yeah, yes. I'm convinced. I live now in downtown Lexington, and if they said there was going to be a public execution in downtown Lexington at a certain day and time, you could say, I can bet you one thing, George Wright will not be there. That I would not go and see, even if you said that somebody, quote, deserved to die or something like that. My view of the sanctity of human life would be I would not want to see that. So I think it made me have a certain level of empathy for the people who were victims by this. And what it also did, lynchings of one person, let's say in 10 years, if you say, oh, only one lynching occurred in this part of Kentucky in a 10-year period, but the statement that it made to everybody, it permeated, and it was a warning to everyone. It was, as Richard Hofstadter said, an effective measure of control. Just like the beating of one slave. It's no coincidence that slave owners would make other slaves come and watch. You didn't have to be beat to understand what a beating was like.
I assisted in a case, a capital case, in the early 2000s. It was probably 2008. It was just before my son James was born, and it was in the actual murder had taken place maybe in 2000, the late 1990s, in a small town in East Texas. And one of the things you do in cases like that is to go and do mitigation research, where you go to the town and you interview people to get a sense of race relations. And in that case, the mitigation investigators found that almost every person they talked to believed that life was so difficult for Black people in that town, right? We're at the turn of the 21st century because of a lynching that had happened there in the 1920s. That was particularly violent. And people just kept mentioning it as the reason why things were so terrible there. So it's the real lingering impact, right? It may be for decades in a community when something like that happens. One of the students asked a little bit about methods. So how did you find these undocumented and unreported cases? And was the information difficult to gather?
Okay. Well, very interestingly, right here at the University of Kentucky, but then you can go out from there. Every county in Kentucky has a public library. Some of them even have a local historical society. Well, if you go to your county, pick any county, they probably have a local history section. And so they're likely to have folders, newspaper clippings and other things, and they will even likely have a local county history. Now, here's what the local county history, published in 1925, it would talk primarily about prominent whites, about political things, so on down the line, but invariably, they will have a section called the darker side or a dark incident or something like that. And they themselves will document the lynching. Or again, the Courier Journal, the Lexington paper, the Frankfurt newspaper, they often did those. By 1910, anywhere a lynching was about to happen or immediately thereafter, the NAACP sent reporters there. So those records exist. And as I mentioned earlier, for the early period, there are actually government records, Record Group 105 in the National Archives, that document the violence that occurred against Blacks all over the South during the Reconstruction period. So those are a number of sources. Dr. Price, you mentioned one other thing about the lingering effects. Back when I was a professor at the University of Kentucky in the 1970s, I had my students do local history projects, and a number of them did oral histories. Mm-hmm. And so they would interview white and Black people in their communities who are at a certain age, and they would document it. Some of you may know Dr. Terry Birdwhistle, who has his his master's degree in history, then his doctorate degree in education. I and Terry, we went to all 120 counties together, and we go to Logan County, and the person who was, one of the local officials in the 1980s was the grandson of the man who had been there when these 4 young men had been lynched. And Terry and I interviewed them. And then at a certain point, I become very, very angry at the comments that he's making. And Terry looks at me and says, "George, you're supposed to just be interviewing this person." And I'm beating up on the person. And the next thing we know, we end the interview, and Terry Birdwhistle and I, we love each other. We're hollering at each other at the top of our lungs as we walk down the street of Russellville. And folk are looking at us dressed like I am now and said, "What are these two Internal Revenue Service workers doing here?" And so forth. Okay.
I think Dr. Birdwhistle is with us in the webinar today. I saw his name earlier.
Oh, okay. So, well, I could let Terry speak for himself. And he traveled with me to Trigg County, to Marshall County, to all sorts of places when I conducted this research.
We have several questions about how you might relate the history that you have uncovered to the current concerns around in cases like the Breonna Taylor case that's happening in Kentucky right now.
Okay. Cool. I asked the question at the end, when did legal lynchings end? When did, in my book, I talk about several instances of Black people being shot and killed and nothing done, no charges brought and so forth. I'm now writing a book on a man named Robert Benjamin, who was shot and killed in Lexington on October the 3rd, 1900. He was shot in the back by a white man 6 times, and the coroner said justifiable homicide in that regard. So the question is that it's very difficult to say with any clarity that this practice has ended completely. I'm willing to concede that mobs don't break people out of jail now. I'm willing to concede that the governor of Kentucky does not stand by if he knew someone was about to be attacked and so forth. But Black people not serving on jury, Black people not having adequate attorneys, and I didn't even talk about something that I know you're very aware of, Dr. Price, prosecutors using their discretion as to what to decide to charge someone with works to the disadvantage of African Americans. So I think that these are questions that are still open today, unfortunately.
So we've gotten several questions about, you already mentioned the Equal Justice Initiative lynching memorial, but we've gotten several questions on how you think we should remember this history. And to add on to that, someone also asked about the number of Confederate memorials. So what do you think is the appropriate way that Kentucky can memorialize or create monuments around this particular history? Sorry.
No question about it. I mentioned the historian Richard Hofstadter.
Yes.
One of the another leading historian is a man named Kenneth Stamp. And Kenneth Stamp is remembered best for his book on slavery in the American South, 1800 to 1860. But he also wrote a book called Reconstruction after the Civil War. And in that book, he says that perhaps at no point in the history of humankind, he said, perhaps at no other point in the history of humankind have people involved in an unsuccessful revolt against their own government been treated so leniently as we decided to treat those folk. He said, in a war that had almost 1 million casualties, injuries, and deaths, here's what we allow. And at the same time, we then allow these people to turn around and wreak havoc on the men who had supported the United States government, Black soldiers. I didn't go into the whole thing about Black soldiers being lynched in uniforms after the Civil War and so forth. So somehow we have to have a conversation about what happened in the aftermath of slavery. What happened to the ex-slaves? What should we have done for the ex-slaves? And what is the proper role? What should be the proper role of ex-Confederate thing? You're from Texas. You could very easily say to them that in Texas, like most of the other southern states, the state capitol that was built after the Civil War faces southward with its back to the Union. On Texas's Capitol ground, then go to others, they have monuments to the Confederate lost cause. And one of them says, these people greatly outnumbered, fought until exhausted, right? 10 to 1, 20 to 1, you're bound to lose, but they fought valiantly to the end. Is that really what happened? And then what happened about the folk who were lost? So there needs to be some conversations about that. You also say, what about monuments? I would also say in Texas, they have put up a monument to the Black soldiers to try to balance that. What is Kentucky doing about its monuments to the lost cause? But at the very least, we've got to talk about that. And I hinted at it, we even have to talk about the issue of reparations. What about these folk that came out of slavery with only the clothes on their backs? In that sense, so conversations at the very least need to be had about these things.
So you stole that was my next question about whether or not there was any efforts to make repair in Kentucky around any of the racial violence. So do you know of any specific efforts to do so here in Kentucky?
I don't, but that doesn't mean there haven't been some. That I would defer to someone else. Here's what I will say. Right now, the University of Kentucky has its DE&I implementation plan. Well, this summer, one of our border states, Virginia, the University of Virginia, issued its diversity plan, and in it, it says that the University of Virginia has got to look at reparations in two ways. One, for the indigenous people whose land the University of Virginia sits on. Same is true for Kentucky. The same is true for Wisconsin. The same is true everywhere. And two, what about the people who were enslaved themselves? And so they talked about scholarships need to be done. There are certain things they need to do through their Carter G. Woodson Institute. I realize I'm giving you a Virginia, not a Kentucky example. So there may be someone on this webinar who may know something that, again, some other part of Kentucky other than Lexington or Louisville may be talking about. But clearly, these are issues that we need to at least talk about in Kentucky and elsewhere. And I might also add, I didn't want to prolong my conversation today. It's fascinating. Again, most people forget that slavery ended last in Kentucky of all the places in the Union, right? 4 slave states remain in the Union: Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky. The numbers of people enslaved in those other states were relatively small. Over 100,000 people are enslaved in Kentucky when the Civil War breaks out. Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which talked about the use of Black soldiers, leads to freedom for some, but the Civil War ends in April 1865. There are 40 to 50,000 people still enslaved in Kentucky. December the 31st, 1865, ends slavery in Kentucky, some 6 months after slavery had ended everywhere else. So Kentucky really has that distinction of being last.
Can you quickly name the documentary you mentioned about Corbin?
Yes, Don't Let the Sun Go Down. A filmmaker by the name of Robbie Henson was the main person, and I worked with him, and let's call it a consultant or something like that. And you'll even see instances of me in the film, talking about various places in Corbin and pointing out where the incident occurred and that type of thing. And I probably even say, you know what, I think it's about time I get out of here. I think enough is enough for being here, this type of thing. But it's a film, and it should still be available. Don't Let the Sun Go Down.
I'm going to ask one last question and combine it with the last question that's here. And before I ask this final question, I just want to let all of you who are viewing us today that this is part of a series of virtual events held by the Gaines Center for the Humanities. And our next one will be October 7th, where our former colleague and National Book Award winning poet, Nikki Finney, will be doing a reading from her new book on October 7th at 6 p.m. And you can find the link for the registration also through Eventbrite. So before we go, could you tell us a little bit about the person in the Q&A asked about the recent executive action by the federal government on the part of the president to stop training around racial sensitivity training. And I'm going to add to that, what are the lessons? Why do we need to continue to learn, not from the violence, but from those who fought against the violence? What should we be learning? And why is it still so important that we continue to engage in teaching and training people around anti-discrimination?
Okay. I saw over the weekend, as did you, since someone referencing it, that the president said that he was going to cut off federal funds to places that were involved in diversity type of training. Since then, he's even said that any places that were involved in the 1619 project that the New York Times had made available, he would do the same thing there. Well, interestingly enough, the federal government, and I will actually say the military is part of the federal government, is often considered, for most people, if you said the military, you'd say, quote, conservative in that sense. But back in the 1960s, various branches of the military started doing certain type of training to make people more aware of the type of people who were in the military in that regard. And that evolved into certain things that you would learn about, again, maybe Japanese Americans, um, um, Native Americans, African Americans, and so forth. And I have long believed, and I think others as well, that the more you learn about other people, and I put other in parentheses, you learn about the contributions that they made. Recall some of the debate over the kneeling, over the when the national anthem has been played. Drew Brees first said, "My father fought in the Second World War." These black football players said, "My father fought and was discriminated in the Second World War, was paid less, had to experience all sorts of Jim Crow things." And there, my wife's father, who lives with us, was a soldier in that segregated thing. So you find out that Black people have made contributions at every point in American society. But for me, if you do this type of training, you'll also learn about the role of women in American society and how women have been treated. And in this context, I'm talking about all women, not just African American women, have been discriminated against in ways that are also inconsistent, but then come to Black women, and then you have the double or triple dose of discrimination there. So first, you'll learn about the contributions. And for me, and I realize not everybody agrees with me on this point, the more you learn about, quote, other people, the more you can see some common threads between other people and however you characterize yourself. And that I think it's important for us to learn about the struggles of other people. And again, as a person who grew up knowing about racial discrimination, when people told me about the discrimination of religious groups, the discrimination of women, the discrimination of gay people, it resonated with me because I can understand what it's like to be considered an outsider or stereotyped in some way. So I think to take that away is to reinforce to some people that there's a homogenous way of looking at our country and that these other things are negative. You see, what you can say that Drew Brees didn't understand initially is that Black people love America in spite of America not loving them. Drew Brees and other folk love America because America loved them. What you'll find out, America hasn't loved all of its people equally. And so I think that's what diversity does. It's not an opportunity to beat up on white people. If I had talked more in depth about things, there are examples in Kentucky of white people speaking out against lynchings. There are examples in Kentucky of a sheriff or two who lost his life defending his Black prisoner against a white mob. So there are clearly cases of that. And so we need to know the roles of white people, Black people, Jewish people, all people in bringing about change.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes.
I think this was the exact right way to kick off this year where the Gain Center is focused on the question of citizenship, which could also be a question of belonging. And one of the ways that the belonging of Black people has been policed is through violence, both in the past and some might argue contemporarily. So thanks again for doing this.
Well,
And I'm
you.
sure the other participants would like to extend their thanks as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to send one more quick reminder about October 7th with the poet and National Book Award winning poet Nikki Finney, and be on the lookout for other events from the Gain Center for the Humanities going forward this year. Thanks, George.
Thank you. Good night.